Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, An American Tale, The Evolution of U.S. Wildlife Management, is brought to you by NatHab Expedition Leader Aaron Bott. A little bit more about our presenter. Aaron is a wildlife biologist and doctoral student at Utah State University, where he studied wolves across the American West to help promote coexistence between humans and carnivores. With deep roots in the Mountain West dating back to the mid 1800s, Aaron brings both the expertise of a scientist and the intimate knowledge of a true local to his guiding. He spent over 15 years as a naturalist and wilderness guide throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and Colorado Plateau. Thank you so much for being here today, Aaron. Take it away.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm very grateful that we could meet on a Thursday virtually. I always wish that we could do these things in person, but I'm very grateful for the technology that we do have in order to somehow, at least virtually, meet together and ask questions and learn from one another. Today's presentation hopefully will be fascinating to many of you. Every time I'm preparing these webinars, I always find myself in a catch-22, a bit of a bind, because there's so much content and material that I would love to cover, and 45 minutes to an hour just really isn't sufficient to get into all of the juicy fat that I would like to get into regarding these subjects. So thanks for tuning in today. And I guess that's my caveat, is that we're going to be talking about quite a huge time period in history, the history of North America and our human involvement on the landscape. Most of our conversation today, though, will be talking about wildlife management policy and practices which have taken place really over the last 150 years or so. But it still is a lot of history to cover. And so you're going to have to bear with me and take things in stride, as I'm not going to be able to get into all of the details that I would like to get into. But hopefully this will be a pretty good overview and refresher for some of you, and maybe for another handful of you, this is your first exposure to seeing how wildlife has been managed and is managed in the United States. As was mentioned in my bio, I'm a biologist in the United States, and so this is a United States-centric presentation. Although what we're going to be talking about, especially towards the end of my presentation, is what is commonly referred to as the North American model for wildlife management. It's not the only model out there, as is implied by the name. Different countries and different continents have different systems for managing their wildlife. However, the United States really pioneered the way for a unique, publicly accessible wildlife management process. And so that's why I'm delivering this presentation today. Hopefully it can help you understand, if you're in the United States, a little bit more about the processes of wildlife governance and conservation. So before we begin, it's important that we define a couple of things. First, what is wildlife? It seems like a pretty harmless question, but it's an important question if we're going to be spending the next hour talking about the management of wildlife. In a nutshell, wildlife has traditionally been viewed as animals that are free-ranging and wild. They're not domesticated, and they live in their native habitats. So wildlife, in its historical context, would include great free-ranging migrating bison herds, elk herds, pronghorn. It would also include the predators on those landscapes. It would include a whole variety of different classes of animals, not just your mammals. It would include reptiles and birds. Technically, we can also include our fishes in that group as well. But wildlife is animals that are not privately owned. They're not domesticated and they're free ranging throughout their natural and native habitats. This is important to define because there are, in some cases, animals which we have domesticated, which then became feral when they roam on the landscape, but they're not necessarily native, and they are not they're not wild. They were domesticated, or at least their ancestors were domesticated, which brings into question some sticky areas around, for example, wild horses and wild burros. We also have non-native species as well, species which don't belong in certain areas. They are invasive. They were introduced usually by humans purposefully or naively into ecosystems and are now causing problems to the native habitats and the native wildlife populations in those areas. So today we're going to be talking about wildlife and wildlife management. And that's our definition for wildlife. Again, wild, free-ranging, undomesticated animals and their habitats. Now, why manage? Management implies some kind of hands-on, proactive, and in some cases reactive involvement by humans. Why can't we just let nature take its course? Why do we have to get involved? Why do we have to manage? Why do we need biologists? Why do we have to have multi-stakeholder groups getting together to discuss policies for conservation? Why not just let nature take its course? Well, unfortunately, the reality is that humans have disrupted the natural world to such a degree that we simply must choose to be involved in order to help promote ecosystem integrity wherever possible. A lot of the systems in the natural world today have been so fractured by anthropogenic causes or challenges that if humans simply stepped away and took no responsibility, then many wildlife populations would very quickly go extinct. It takes proactive behavior and policies and boots on the ground in order to maintain healthy, viable ecosystems. And so in this situation, management, like I said, is very hands-on. And if we stop caring, then many wildlife species will go extinct and many ecosystems will fall apart more rapidly. And so it really takes concerted effort by those of us who are invested, those of us who care, those of us who are passionate to stand up for systems and species that can't speak for themselves. This is why I became a wildlife biologist. I am fascinated with the natural world. I am deeply impressed, as many of you are, with just how complex and beautiful the natural world can be. And I decided to make a career spending a lot of my time dedicated to trying to promote a better and healthier understanding of the natural world and working hard to protect wildlife populations. Ultimately, when it comes down to wildlife management, you're looking at a few different courses of action. One popular and often necessary course is to help to promote population growth. So as certain populations have declined over the years, biologists and wildlife managers work to try and help those populations to rebound or recover. To help with this process, we have a lot of different management policies in place. One of the greatest, which we'll talk about later, is the Endangered Species Act. It's to help populations recover. So that's one mode of practice for wildlife management. Conversely, in some situations, wildlife management requires reducing populations. If we have an overabundance of a specific species and it's destabilizing the natural system, then we have to figure out how to best bring an environmental equilibrium back to the playing field in order to help all population or all species benefit from a rather complex system. So as biologists and as wildlife managers, most of the time we're talking about populations. Populations are essential for the ecosystem, and individuals, of course, make up populations. So we're dealing with individual organisms in order to help promote sustainability across the ecosystem at large. So we're going to spend the next several slides talking about the history of humans in North America and our involvement with wildlife and how we created a system where we are managing our wildlife today, and some of the strengths of that system, but also some of the shortcomings of that system as well. To begin with, I'd like us all to acknowledge that humans are animals, and we are part of the ecosystems which we evolved in. Humans are the ultimate ecosystem engineers. An ecosystem engineer is an organism which helps to shape its own environment. It can include species like beavers. Beavers are a very popular kind of poster child of an ecosystem engineer. They are manipulating their habitats. They are augmenting their habitats in many cases. Humans, however, are the ultimate ecosystem engineers, and we always have been, regardless of our background, which continent we came from, which area of the world we live in. Humans have always manipulated our own environments in order to produce more suitable habitats for our own needs. And this again goes all the way back to the dawn of humanity, to 2.5–3 million years ago. And as humans migrated out of Africa and spread across the globe, we have constantly engaged with other environments and habitats and ecosystems. And for better or for worse, we have altered those ecosystems. And specifically here in North America, as humans began migrating into the Americas across the Bering Land Bridge 15 to 20,000 years ago, they, as a new species arriving upon these continents, greatly impacted the environments which they encountered. As soon as humans started to migrate into the Americas during the late Pleistocene or Ice Age, we began to see massive extinctions of many of the large megafauna which roamed across the continents. And during this time period, we lost 35 mammalian genres of animals and 10 bird genera that went extinct. And a lot of archaeologists and paleontologists get into the weeds as to what caused the extinction of these large animals, such as mammoths and mastodons and camels and horses, which once roamed across the continent. There are variables such as climate change and shifting patterns of vegetative growth, but ultimately humans are undoubtedly one of the greatest primary causes for large mammalian extinction in North America. And this is similarly documented in other places around the globe where humans settled as they again expanded across the globe as a species. We as a species are great at cooperating. That's kind of our superpower. We work hard together. In order to do this, we have strong and well-knit social groups. And by teamwork, we're able to overcome very many challenges, which as individuals, we would not be able to overcome. And this includes the killing of large animals which are much larger than ourselves. And as humans again settled in the Americas, we significantly impacted our environment here. Over the next several thousand years, indigenous impacts and diversity on the Americas varied greatly, but it's needless to say, many of the peoples who lived here had complex social lives and lived in impressive interwoven civilizations which interacted directly with the natural world. And for thousands of years, millions of humans lived in the Americas. Specifically in North America, we had several tens of millions of humans that were engaged with the natural world. They built civilizations, they had complex and intensive agricultural practices as well as hunting practices. And through their manipulation of fire regimes and burning forests in order to generate more agricultural lands, and the implementation of dam building in order to promote irrigation for crops, as well as ritualized hunting practices, humans definitely engaged with the wildlife on the continents very complexly. And humans had a large footprint in North America prior to European settlement of the continent. So as indigenous peoples were living here in North America, they were constantly engaged with wildlife, and in some cases, they were manipulating wildlife behavior, and populations ebbed and flowed based off of the abundance of pressures that the indigenous peoples were putting on wildlife. This is a rather famous painting by Alfred Miller of one of the ritual practices by many of the Plains Indians for buffalo jumps, where a large number of bison were herded up and essentially corralled off of a steep cliff, where then the indigenous peoples could go down below and they could harvest the meat from these animals. But this is just one of the practices, again, as humans being predators and ecosystem engineers ultimately interacted with wildlife in diverse ways. As Europeans came into contact with North America and began to establish themselves and colonize North America, one of the greatest disruptors to the system that they brought as colonizers was the advent of certain pathogens. So diseases came with many European peoples, and these diseases ultimately became a tremendous and very grave depopulating factor for the indigenous peoples who lived here in the Americas. And even before many of the indigenous peoples even engaged with physically Europeans, the diseases that came with the Europeans to the North American continent swept across the landscape. And it's estimated that 75 to 95% of the indigenous people communities that lived across North America died because of disease that was brought by the Europeans. Now, something that's important to recognize here is that in Europe, the practice of agriculture extended not just from the growing of plants and crops, but also included livestock husbandry. In the Americas, livestock husbandry was really non-existent prior to European settlement. The only domestic dog that was really persistent in North America prior to European contact was the domestic dog, which had been domesticated in Eurasia thousands of years prior to the migrations which led to the human establishment in North America. And as Europeans practiced livestock husbandry, they had inadvertently exposed themselves to many pathogens through animals, zoonotic diseases, which then spilled over into human populations and became some of the greatest causes of mortality in human history, such as smallpox and many other diseases. But over thousands of years of coexisting with their livestock and living in close proximity to domestic animals, Europeans had a higher tolerance of these diseases than did the indigenous peoples of North America. And so as Europeans came over here to the Americas, the diseases that the indigenous peoples were not exposed to or had not been exposed to were rampant, and they very severely decimated populations of indigenous cultures and civilizations all across the continent. And not only did humans bring pathogens which spread to other humans, but also livestock brought pathogens which spread to wildlife populations. When Europeans first began to settle North America, one of the monetary attractions of the continent was the abundance of wildlife which was seen. It's important to realize that, again, tens of millions of indigenous peoples lived here in the Americas, but as soon as Europeans began to make contact with the Americas in the late 1400s and early 1500s, diseases very quickly spread across the continent and depopulated many areas of North America. And so by the time Lewis and Clark in the early 1800s began to explore the interior of the continent, many indigenous civilizations had already been depopulated. And the human population, the indigenous human population in North America, was at an all-time low, the lowest it had been for many thousands of years. And with a smaller human presence on the landscape, wildlife actually were on the rebound. Many wildlife populations were growing to a point that their abundance was greater than it had been for many hundreds of years. And so you had this kind of weird paradoxical overlap where suddenly indigenous populations, the human presence and human footprint in North America was shrinking due to disease outbreaks. Europeans weren't very abundant in the Americas yet. And so with fewer humans, wildlife populations grew to all-time highs, at least the highest they'd been in many thousands of years, many hundreds of years at the very least. And as Europeans traveled and explored across North America, they were impressed with the abundance of wildlife in many of these areas. And very quickly, they saw opportunities to capitalize off of wildlife. And so market hunting became one of the biggest resources, monetary resources for Europeans in the New World. Market hunting is basically the capturing, killing, and selling of wildlife products, animals, in order to gain capital. And everything from the fur market with sea otter trade along the Columbia and Pacific Northwest to beaver trapping and eradication by the Hudson Bay Fur Company and the American mountain men expeditions in the early 1800s. All of this generated a lot of steep competition to try and, again, capture and kill as many fur-bearing animals as possible to sell these products overseas for luxury items such as hats and jackets and coats. And some of the wealthiest people in the European world were associated with the fur market and the fur market trade. And as a lot of fur-bearing species began to decline in number due to this market hunting, people also took advantage of the larger native wildlife populations, such as deer and pronghorn and elk, and most famously, bison. If you haven't seen this picture before, those things that this gentleman is standing next to are all bison skulls. Bison were and still are the largest species of mammal, terrestrial animal in North America today in modern times. And they once roamed across the continent in the tens of millions. But as Europeans began to establish themselves and colonize and move westward and saw a monetary opportunity to gain from selling the meat and the hides of these animals, it was very easy to access a gun and bullets and go out and to try and shoot some of these animals and then sell the meat and the hides for money. And again, it didn't take long for business ventures to jump on this opportunity to try and capitalize on animal products as quickly as possible. And because of this, a lot of the wildlife which had been rebounding, if you will, at the turn of the 18th or the 19th and the 17th and 18th century, and then into the 19th century, suddenly got hit broadside with a very aggressive monetary scheme to try and capitalize off of wildlife products, and this drove many abundant animal populations to the point of extinction. Famously, passenger pigeons were an abundant species which no one ever conceived could be so quickly decimated and ultimately go extinct. Sea otter populations were eradicated, beaver populations were eradicated, elk populations were decimated and eradicated in the east, and bison very quickly were targeted in terms of wildlife eradication. And as this began to happen, people became more and more concerned, especially the public who were invested in not capitalizing off of wildlife, but sustaining themselves from wildlife and having opportunities to benefit from wildlife on the landscape. And this brings forth one of the more important topics of our presentation today, the Public Trust Doctrine, which was ultimately created in 1842 in a court case, a Supreme Court case between Martin versus Waddell, which ultimately determined that wildlife and fish cannot be privately owned in the United States. This had a connection to the Magna Carta in 1215, where the United States, taking pride in its attempts at democracy, wanted to basically show that anyone had a right to wildlife and that wildlife could not be owned by someone privately. This is different from the old European model where landowners owned all of the wildlife and fish on their property, and they were entitled to that. But here in the Americas, in North America, in the United States specifically, it was determined early on that fish and wildlife belonged to the public at large, and that the governments were responsible for managing and protecting wildlife on behalf of the people. Again, this is really a cool aspect in our wildlife management history, where if you think about your popular stories of Robin Hood, for example, Robin Hood was out poaching the king's deer. That's why he was always getting in trouble. He was robbing from the rich, the landowners who had lots of land, lots of acreage of forest, and they owned the deer that were on that property. And it was illegal for the commoners, for the peasants, to subsist off of those resources. But here in the United States, it was determined that no, nobody can own wildlife. And this had ultimately great benefits to how we manage wildlife today, but it also had some negative impacts as well. One of those negative impacts is that organizations and commercial ventures said, well, if no one owns wildlife, I can go out and shoot as much of it as I want. And I don't need a license. I don't need a permit or anything. I can just shoot it and then I can sell it. And it's just easy money for the taking. But this is where wildlife as a public trust in its protection by the government comes into play. So through the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution, it's basically stated that anything that is not covered by the federal government in terms of management will be by default transitioned to the authority of state power. So through the 10th Amendment, it was determined that states had a responsibility to manage wildlife on behalf of the public. And it's the same setup today. So this is important for you to realize if you live in the United States, that no matter where you live, Rhode Island or Hawaii or Texas or Montana or California or Alaska, your state has its own wildlife agency, and they are responsible for monitoring and managing the wildlife within its boundaries on behalf of the public. And unfortunately and confusingly, every state has its own unique wildlife agency name, it seems like. In Utah, it's the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. And in Oregon, it's the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. In Montana, it's Montana Parks, Wildlife, and Fish. But regardless of its name, your state has an agency which is responsible for having stewardship over the wildlife within its boundaries. Now, as this recognition of government oversight came into play, the problem was that states weren't empowered with the resources they needed in order to manage wildlife populations. And they certainly were bare bones when it came to enforcing any punishments upon people who violated wildlife regulations. So even though it was recognized early on that states had authority over managing their wildlife populations, the states didn't have the expertise, the energy, or really the financial backing and muscle in order to actually back up their empowered responsibility to protect wildlife. And it was recognized by the end of the 1800s that this was not working. The system was not working. Our deer, our elk, our bison populations were still very quickly going extinct, and states just didn't have the resources to do anything about it. And so, due to some invested early conservationist efforts, the federal government got involved, first and foremost through the Lacey Act of 1900, where suddenly it became a federal offense to transport illegally held wildlife across state lines. So in many cases where market hunting was still being practiced, if it was against the law to kill an animal in one state, people were taking that slain animal and they were transporting it across state boundaries in order to take it to market and to sell it. And suddenly, with the Lacey Act of 1900, it no longer was just an issue for the states to deal with this. It now brought the federal government into play, and they were now empowered to press charges if people were violating any of these basic wildlife laws. So this, I should say right now, the reason why I have this photograph stuck up here is because it was at the same time that one of the larger public outcries against wildlife crimes came due to the quickly diminishing populations of birds which we had in North America. It was the fashion of the day for many fine hats to be made with the plumage of native bird species. And bird hats, such as the one being worn by this individual in this photograph, were very popular. And it was very quickly and unfortunately leading to the extinction and eradication of many native bird populations. And so the Lacey Act helped in part to curb the eradication of many of these birds by putting into place laws, federal laws, which prohibited the transfer of animal parts across state lines. Now, it can't be overstated just how important Theodore Roosevelt was to our modern conservation system. Theodore Roosevelt became president in the early 1900s, and he was born of a wealthy family in the East and had wealthy connections to individuals, mostly men, who were deeply invested in hunting hobbies, hobbies that were engaged in the outdoors. Most people who were settling the continent, who were participating in westward expansion, they didn't have the means, the resources, the time, or the ability to participate in things of luxury like sport hunting. However, other individuals in the East who were affluent and who were politically well connected and well educated and in tight-knit circles, they cherished the opportunities that they had in order to go out hunting and fishing. And Theodore Roosevelt was a dedicated big game hunter. And he was also an ornithologist at heart. He loved birds and he loved the natural world and he loved getting out in the woods. He believed it was good for the human soul to spend time in the out of doors. And he, along with other folks like Gifford Pinchot, who helped to transform American forestry practices, argued that the natural world and natural resources belonged to everyone. It was a part of America's heritage to have access to wild places and wild things. And they got involved with folks like John Muir, who on the other side of the spectrum was a radical in promoting preservation of the natural world for its own aesthetic benefits rather than utilitarian reasons only. So men like Theodore Roosevelt, George Bird Grinnell, Gifford Pinchot, and John Muir worked very hard in Washington, D.C. to protect natural resources. And I'm going to go ahead and read this wonderful quote from Theodore Roosevelt. "Our duty to the whole, including the unborn generations, bids us to restrain an unprincipled present-day minority from wasting the heritage of these unborn generations." Theodore Roosevelt hammered time and time again that we owed the conservation of the natural world not just for our immediate use and benefit, but also for future generations. And this was huge. And with his political muscle, the course of the United States' history and its engagement with the natural world completely changed. Theodore Roosevelt set aside more wildlife refuges and public lands for wildlife habitat than any other president in America's history. And he pushed very hard these agendas of conservation. It was also at this time, too, I'll quickly note that he, who engaged quite a lot with John Muir, it was at this time that the conservation movement had a bit of a schism where they divided between conservation as the means of protecting wild places and wild things versus preservation. Preservation is to leave things untouched. And by way of an example, the National Park System today looks at preservation for their model, where things are left unmeddled by humans as much as possible, if that is possible, versus conservation, like our U.S. Forest Service lands and the Bureau of Land Management lands, which have multi-use purposes, where not only are they there for the benefit of wildlife and for recreation, but they're also there as a means to responsibly harvest natural resources in a sustainable way. So again, that's Theodore Roosevelt in the progressive era, and it's important to also recognize that he was not the most popular person in the world for doing this. In fact, the next several presidencies, the next several administrations that came after Theodore Roosevelt worked very hard to roll back a lot of the progress that Theodore Roosevelt had made in terms of natural resource and wildlife conservation. But again, one of the biggest hiccups overall for wildlife, and this remains an issue today, is how do we pay for conservation? To promote conservation, you have to have money available in order to buy up habitat or to conduct wildlife research or to work to promote wildlife populations in their regrowth in areas where they've been decimated or eradicated. And this was a major issue in the turn of the century. And again, it still is an issue today. But one of the solutions that we arrived at was states began to issue hunting license cells. And this began in Pennsylvania in 1913. But states who had management authority over their wildlife populations began to regulate how wildlife could be hunted. And if you want to hunt wildlife, you have to buy a hunting license. And by the selling of hunting licenses, most state wildlife agencies today are funded. Most wildlife biologists that work are funded through the sales of hunting licenses and fishing licenses as well. Then in the 1930s, the Pittman-Robertson Act was a federal maneuver which brought a tax on the sale of arms and ammunition, hunting arms and ammunition, including archery. This is an 11% tax, which goes completely towards wildlife research, wildlife conservation, and habitat restoration. This money can't be used for anything else. This also includes a 10% tax on handguns. And this Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937 has incredibly benefited wildlife conservation all across the country. States can receive 75% of their wildlife education conservation funds through the Pittman-Robertson Act, and the states are required to match this by 25% of that. So again, this incredible tax was generated, and even today, a lot of our wildlife conservation is supported by the selling of firearms and ammunition, as well as hunting license sales. Now, jumping back just a little bit, it was just before, well, a few decades before Theodore Roosevelt, that the world's first national park was created, Yellowstone National Park, in 1872. And this was at the recommendation of several interested parties who saw that Yellowstone was a beautiful landscape. There was not a lot of utilitarian worth. There was not a lot of mining opportunities or agricultural opportunities on that landscape, but perhaps that area of the world could be designated as a public park, a place where the public could go and enjoy the geothermal anomalies of the landscape. And this set a trend for, of course, the National Park Service, which we have today, where we have many wild areas which are protected for the enjoyment of people, but also indirectly they procure habitats which benefit wildlife populations. Likewise, the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management manage many public lands, which are lands that the federal government controls and has oversight of. And they are responsible, again, not just for human pleasures and recreating, but they are responsible for protecting habitat and preserving these lands from development. One of the greatest tragedies of wildlife conservation anywhere is the loss of habitat for wildlife. And especially coming into the 1900s, a lot of urbanization began to take place all across America, and a lot of wildlife suffered indirectly, not through hunting or trapping or poisoning or any of that, but just through systematically losing their habitat. And by protecting large public swaths of land, we were ultimately protecting, in many cases, habitat for wildlife. These acted as places of refuge for wildlife. And going back to Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressive Era, a lot of those early conservationists really promoted protecting wild public lands because they realized that wildlife depended upon those habitats in order to thrive. Now, moving forward into the 1920s and 30s, and then ultimately the 40s, this gentleman here, Aldo Leopold, is considered one of the great wildlife conservationists of all time. He's someone who if you haven't heard of him, should become familiar with his name because of his genius. Aldo Leopold in the 1930s became celebrated as a scientist for his understanding of the importance of practicing a healthy land ethic. He recognized that if humans want to thrive on the landscape, they ultimately depend upon having healthy landscapes. And these healthy landscapes are only healthy if ecosystems are held intact. And he became a loud voice promoting everything from large carnivore conservation to managing our water systems in a sensible way, and ultimately protecting the soil in a way that is going to sustain not just humans, but wildlife. And it was during this time that wildlife became professionalized, and the governments, states and federal, began to realize that there was something to be said about gaining scientific knowledge and understanding of the natural world and implementing that in an applied way in order to benefit the community at large and to benefit the natural world. And so it was at this time that many universities began to develop and establish schools dedicated towards the scientific understanding of wildlife and natural resources. And this is the dawn of the scientific era for wildlife and the study of ecosystems. The word ecosystem was not even coined until 1935. And so when it comes to understanding and appreciating ecosystems and wildlife and predator-prey relations and all of that, forestry management, it's important for us to realize that we were acting for a very long time without having scientific data to support our actions or to direct our actions. And it was in a great part thanks to Aldo Leopold and others like him that we began to transition into a more scientific based directive for wildlife management. And this led to the environmental awakening era. So this picture is that of Rachel Carson, who worked for the federal government as a biologist and is famous for publishing her book, Silent Spring, which brought to light the damage that was being caused on the environment by pesticides and chemicals. After World War II, many GIs came home and went into the natural resources as a field of career interest. And there was never a stronger moment in history where you had so many people invested in recreating in the outdoors and wanting to learn about the outdoors and being frankly proud of their outdoor heritage as when the GIs came home. And scientists and our scientific appreciation of the natural world as we were just getting started to learn about the environment was really met with popular enthusiasm. And it was also at this time, due to post-war prosperity, that industrial agriculture really made leaps and bounds. And because of this, decisions were being made which ultimately brought into conflict industry and conservation. And it was people like Rachel Carson who brought public awareness of the negative impacts of agricultural practices with chemicals and deforestation, and what that caused for wildlife in the natural world, which really galvanized the public at large and helped them to realize just how important it was for us to collectively work together and to try and procure policies and better management practices of the natural world. And it was in part thanks to Rachel Carson and others that we had a big movement in the 1960s and the 1970s to push for governments to create policies which would help protect the natural world. And it was during the Richard Nixon administration that in 1974, the Endangered Species Act was created, which is arguably the environmental act with the most muscle to protect wildlife, not only to acknowledge that wildlife can become imperiled, but also create a way forward to helping them recover. The Endangered Species Act creates a system which mandates we have proactive plans in place to try and help those species which are imperiled or are in the possibility of becoming imperiled recover. It helps to generate funds for that. We also created acts to protect our water and our air. And again, this was really due to the public's enthusiasm about the environment and scientific understanding of the natural world. And yeah, it's in part thanks to Rachel Carson and others who brought awareness of the fragility of the environment that helped us move forward in creating some of these policies to protect and preserve the natural world. And because of these things, a lot of systems, a lot of ecosystems and environments have been cleaned up, and certain species which were on the brink of going extinct have recovered since then. And this goes straight into our current system, our current complexities. As is always the case in politics, and I think is very important for us to remember as we look back in history, the moves to protect the environment and to protect wildlife have not always been universally accepted. There have been a lot of political swings back and forth as societal values flex and people try and figure out what is important to them related to conservation and wildlife, and what kind of values does wildlife have and the environment have. In the 21st century, we've seen going back and forth again, political swings trying to navigate some of the shortfallings of our understanding of endangered species and what does recovery look like, and trying to tease out some of the definitions, and while accepting the hard truths of reality that humans, we've changed the landscape quite a lot in the last certainly 150 to 200 years. The North American landscape doesn't look like it did 300 years ago, and it doesn't look like, for that matter, what it looked like 15,000 years ago. Humans as ecosystem engineers are heavily invested in manipulating landscapes, and what does this mean for wildlife, and how do we move forward with protecting wildlife? One of the biggest complexities and challenges that we have to date is underfunding of wildlife conservation. I mentioned that the advent of selling hunting licenses and the Pittman-Robertson Act became the bread and butter for wildlife conservation. And today, almost all of your wildlife conservation funding for your biologists, regardless of what species they work with, depend upon the sales of hunting and fishing licenses and the taxes from the sales of firearms. But as people become more urbanized, hunting is not as popular as it once was. Not only that, but there's a greater need for more money to protect more species that we're now aware of. Back in the early 1900s, people were only thinking about the big megafauna. They were thinking about deer and elk and sheep, bighorn sheep and other such critters. But now we understand that less popular, less recognized animals need resources and protection and funding as well. So how do we get that? I mean, there have been ideas thrown forward to try and generate funding for that kind of need. Taxes have been proposed on recreational equipment, from things that are sold like backpacks and bikes and binoculars. But that kind of proposal has been met with a lot of hostility from recreational gear productions, because they don't, of course, want to see a tax. And so trying to figure out where we can get funding to support wildlife is probably one of our greatest concerns right now. Everything that I've talked about today, and this was a lot, again, thank you for sticking with me if you did, can be summed up in what we now call the North American model for wildlife conservation. This is basically a hindsight, a retrospective viewing of what has been done in North America up to this point in time that has worked successfully. And this North American model for wildlife conservation was first recognized and coined in the 1990s. And again, what it is it's looking back over the last 100, 150 years to see what have we done that worked well. And it's kind of held up to date as this model for us moving forward to consider. Ultimately, it boils down to seven pillars. One is that wildlife is held in public trust. Wildlife doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to everyone. This is contended today. There's still a lot of people who are pushing for wildlife to belong to property owners so that they have access to it. They want wildlife to be privatized, but conservation has been successful, in my opinion, as in the opinion of many others, because wildlife has been held in the public's trust. It belongs to everyone, regardless of where you live in the United States. It belongs to everyone. We've also banned market hunting. You cannot kill a deer or an elk or a buffalo, for that matter, and sell its meat. It's illegal to do that. If you hunt, you harvest that animal for your family. You can't profit by it by selling parts of it. Also, wildlife has laws that protect it. So there's a time and a place when you can kill and when you can't kill. And this falls into the fourth point, which is there's no wanton killing. You can't just kill animals for the heck of it. Then it's also recognized that wildlife are an international resource and that science should be the way that we manage wildlife. Everything should be science-based. We should have data and an understanding in order to justify how we act. We shouldn't just be acting based off of our convictions or opinions. And lastly, there's a democracy of hunting. So anyone can hunt, regardless of where you're from or who you are. Everyone has an opportunity to hunt in the United States. So these are the 7 pillars of what's known as the North American model. Again, it's not the only model out there in the world, and there are some failings with the model as well, as we look at it and try and imagine where we're going forward in the next 150 years of wildlife and wildlife management in the United States. But that is ultimately the end of my presentation for today. I know it was a lot of information to go over, but I guess the things that I would hope that you would take away most importantly is that wildlife and wildlife management has been an evolving process in the United States. It's something that we're still trying to figure out. One of the issues that we have is we don't have as much funding as we need in order to conserve and protect and research wildlife as much as we do need, as much as we realize we need. We also have come a long ways from the wanton mass extermination of wildlife to now recognizing that no, it is illegal and irresponsible and unethical to wantonly destroy thousands of animals, millions of animals on the landscape. And the fact that we're having these conversations, we're trying to figure out how humans, as a part of the ecosystem, can coexist with other organisms without disrupting the ecosystem. These are 3 books which I highly recommend. They're more popular books. You can review them and go over kind of the history of the American environmental movement. Douglas Brinkley's a fantastic environmental historian, and I recommend any of his books on this subject material. And yeah, thanks very much. if you have any questions, I've got some time for them.
Wow, Aaron, I always love when you come on because you somehow put an entire coursework of information into your presentations, and they're all so thought-provoking. And I'm getting a lot of questions about that as well, and thoughts on that and everything. And a couple other books I would love to throw out to everybody. The American Serengeti. That's a really great one to just go through the ecosystem and the collapse and the bringing back of today, by Dan Flores. And then I just read Blood Memory, by Ken Burns. I'm going to forget the other author. Another really good one. That one's about the buffalo, the story of the buffalo. So two other books to throw out there for those who love to read. And yeah, I know it's after the hour, but it sounds like you have a couple minutes. And for those who hang around, I would love to ask a couple as well of those that have come in. So, could you talk a little bit more about your thoughts or views about the relocation of wolves to Yellowstone? How does that fit into the greater model of conservation for the U.S. and what that whole, it was a big experiment, really, meant for the progress of conservation in the U.S. moving forward?
Yeah, so I am a wolf biologist, as some of you may know, and I've given a few webinars on the relocation and reintroduction of wolves into the Yellowstone ecosystem. But I'll be brief here in saying that wolves historically ranged as an apex predator all across the contiguous United States, but they were systematically eradicated with many other wildlife species. And as early as the 1930s, Aldo Leopold, who I introduced you to today, he began to propose that some areas of suitable habitat should have wolves restored to the environment because they helped the environment thrive, and they were a part of the system, and wolves as an apex predator were needed in those areas. But it wasn't until actually 1974, the year after the Endangered Species Act was created, that wolves were put on to the Endangered Species Act list. So they were listed as having been regionally extirpated from parts of their historical range in the lower 48 states. So 1974, they're listed, and then 2 decades worth of political maneuvering and discussion and debate finally led to the reintroduction of wolves into the northern Rocky Mountain states. So in 1995 and in 1996, wolves were captured in Alberta and British Columbia, a total of 66 wolves, and were reintroduced into Yellowstone. 31 were released into Yellowstone, and 35 were released into central Idaho. People usually don't know about the Idaho part. They're just focused on Yellowstone. But that was an experiment, as was acknowledged in the comment or the question. People weren't sure if large predator reintroduction could work. And fortunately, thanks to the biology of wolves, wolves are very tenacious. They're very hardy. They're very resilient. They took off and they did very well. And the wolf population has grown and has biologically been successful. They're still very contentious, but the wolf population in the the United States, Northwest, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Washington, and Oregon, it's biologically been a success. Although again, people still are very torn over wolves, very conflicted about them.
And where do plants fit into all of this? Why were they not included when the model was established?
So they were included in the Endangered Species Act. So plants can be listed under the 1973 Endangered Species Act. Today's topic was just focusing on wildlife. And so I was specifically talking about how wildlife is and is not managed. Plants, especially invasive plants, need to be managed, but plants in some ways are easier to manage because they don't get up and walk away from you when you're trying to study them. And it's easier to plant plants and hope that they take root. But you're right, it's all connected. And under the Endangered Species Act, plants are also considered a viable part of the ecosystem and can be imperiled or go extinct. And so there's a whole process to involve plants and vegetation and make sure that it's doing well.
And from your opinion, or if you know of ways that might work, how can we as the people put our dollars essentially where our mouth is? If we don't hunt and we can't buy licenses, how can we use our dollars for conservation funding in the US?
Yeah, I'm glad that that was asked because, again, so much to cover in this presentation today. I wish I had spent more time on a few topics in hindsight. But one is being aware that wildlife conservation, wildlife biology, is supported through the sales of hunting and fishing licenses and the purchase of guns and ammunition. And so if you realize that, oh, I want to help protect wildlife, I don't participate in these activities, then hopefully that can bring about awareness in regards to policy changes. When we're voting, we can support initiatives that empower folks like you, if you don't hunt, so that you can more directly benefit wildlife. It would have been great if that tax on outdoor recreational equipment had been passed in the early 2000s, because then we literally would have so many more billions of dollars to protect wildlife. That's not an extinct idea or possibility. So being aware of political suggestions, policy changes that could empower folks like you is very important. Also, and I didn't build a slide for this, and I wish I would have, in the 1950s onward, non-government organizations, NGOs, have stepped up to bat, realizing like, hey, we don't have a way of directly contributing as individuals. We're going to build organizations for conservation in order to help empower people and to empower ecosystems. Specifically, and perhaps most famously, the Nature Conservancy started in the 1950s. And the Nature Conservancy is dedicated to basically protecting wild landscapes. So they help invest in privatized landscapes and create conservation easements. And they have, and I wish I used to know the number off the top of my head, but tens of millions of acres of land have been protected through these non-government organizations. So there are a lot of non-government organizations which you can contribute to in order to promoting conservation. Different organizations do different things. Some organizations focus exclusively on litigation, and others are more boots on the ground, and you're going to have to do some of your own research to decide what you want your dollars to go towards. But there are opportunities with non-government organizations to promote conservation as well.
I just did a quick Google search, and the AI overview says the Nature Conservancy has protected over 119 million acres of land and over 5,000 river miles globally since its founding in 1951. That is impressive. That is a lot of protected land.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, okay, we are 10 past the hour, Aaron. I could keep you all day, but I'm sure that I should probably let you go soon. So with that, I will turn it to you for any last closing comments.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for sticking with me. Again, when I propose to do a new subject to talk about for NatHab, sometimes I am a little overambitious, and I felt that way this time. But hopefully, you got some exposure to where we're at and how we got here in terms of wildlife management in the United States today. And you have a little bit more of a direct connection due to that understanding with how the wildlife in your backyard can be protected. So thanks very much for tuning in, and I appreciate it.
Yes, and everyone who loves Aaron's thought-provoking webinars, I have him scheduled a lot this quarter. So please keep an eye out for your Sunday e-news for when Aaron is coming back on. And thank you again, Aaron, for taking the time to present for us. And I would like to thank everyone who tuned in. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at 800-543-8917 or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialist would love to help you. And join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and the replay will be available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.